Well, hello. We're going to begin this last panel. I'm going to give first mic to Professor Title because she needs to leave for the airport, so she's going to speak 15 minutes, and then we're going to have questions, and then we will work again with the panel.
Hi. ¿Se oye? Okay. Está bien. Okay. Gracias, Paula, y gracias a la Universidad de Buenos Aires y NYU. Para mí es una linda oportunidad de volver a mi país y fue a donde empecé mi interés en justicia transicional. Y no soy realmente estudiante de Dworkin, pero vine al tópico por mi interés en justicia transicional, and so now I'm going to switch to English. I'm going to share with you a historical moment in the life of Argentina and Ronnie Dworkin, and just hopefully we'll have a chance for exchange. So it's probably known to people in this room, but not widely known because punishment was not a big issue in Ronnie Dworkin's writing, that he came at the invitation of President Alfonsín, the first post-junta democratically elected president, and a visit initiated via conduit between philosopher Carlos Nino, who was in the cabinet, and Ronnie Dworkin, along with several other philosophers, and this was mentioned in the first opening remarks by Lewis, showed his solidarity with the new democracy in that period. And he would not only attend the trials, but he would write two pieces, the English preface to Nunca Más, Never Again, which was published by Farrar Straus, and he also published a long piece in the New York Review of Books called Report from Hell in 1986. And so I wanted to look a little more closely, taking this opportunity of this conference, and also this moment in Argentina, to return to that moment. It's 30 years since the trial of the military junta, and to see what was that engagement about between the Anglo-American philosopher Ronnie Dworkin and Argentina during that period. So 3 questions I'm going to talk about in my 15 minutes. One is why Argentina, what was the problem that the philosophers flew in to engage with? How would we understand the Dworkin-Nino approach to these issues? And possibly thirdly, a broader question about the role of philosophers and public intellectuals in confronting issues of injustice. So I met Carlos Nino at that time, and Alfonsín, and Nino, as everyone knows, very charismatic personality and a compelling thinker, and as we saw in the papers, this conference ended up being an homage also to Carlos Nino as well as to Ronnie Dworkin. He would find himself, along with another penal philosopher in the cabinet, Jaime Malamud, whom I also met in a conference on the transition in Haiti. They were both dealing with a very difficult problem, and that was the question of what were the parameters of justice at the time of the transition. And my argument in the paper that I shared was that the engagement with Dworkin actually led the two of them, both Nino and Dworkin, to this really, I think, a principled position on the role of the trials in helping the country at the time illustrate or represent a different political morality. So what was the problem of justice as it was framed initially, and how did the Dworkin interpretive approach somehow resituate or reframe the problem? Well, at the time of the visit of the philosophers, the way the problem was being posed was that it was a problem of peace versus justice. And this is a very common trope these days. It comes up a lot in questions of transitional justice around the world. And at that time, people were talking about, how to deal with the threat which was presented of the military. There was the threat of a coup. The military had drafted a self-amnesty law before departure. And you also had the broader question of what should the scope of responsibility be in an authoritarian setting. Should it just be the commanders? Should it be the lower rung, the middle level rung, and on to the lowest servicemen? And this was really a very difficult question that the two philosophers, Malamud and Nino, wrote about. And they wrote for law reviews. That was really an intellectual endeavor. They wrote books, and the last book, Radical Evil on Trial, was translated, I believe, by Martin, who's here. So at the time that they were debating these questions here, it's a matter of irony that I was also debating them in New York. There was a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations, and the subject of the first memorandum that I would write on transitional justice in 1991 as a lawyer was what should the relationship be between punishment and democracy. And the way the Americans framed it in New York was, is it possible for the countries of the Southern Cone to have democracies, to establish new democracies if they ended up amnestying their military? And so that was the context. And certainly Malamud and others thought that it was important to have some level of punishment for the military, that there would be a possibility of closing of ranks, but that it was also very important to restore the dignity of victims. And in short, there were a variety of different theories, as many theories as there were philosophers. Carlos Nino recounts this in Radical Evil on Trial. In his earlier writing, Nino had taken a Kantian consent-based view of punishment, and he ended up moving away from this view to considering this to be less an issue of an individual perpetrator's right to his punishment and more a social goal. And I argue in the paper that this was part of the reframing that Dworkin contributed. He wrote about the punishment at the time as a matter of a public good, and this led to a different way to justifying the punishment, and of course a different scope or parameters of punishment. But the broader question also was really what purpose trials had. And there too I argue that Dworkin's interpretive approach, which emphasizes human dignity and political morality, also helped circumscribe the trials. Nino would end up writing that it wasn't important to have an endless number of trials, but rather what was important was understanding in the society and moving, having an education for the future. Nino also wrote about the idea of democratic justice, and I'm sure folks around the table have studied this, and this was part of the conundrum. How do you have democratic justice if there isn't a democracy? And so this also helped to think about a limiting of punishment, because of course effective and legitimate punishment presumed democracy. So how do you move into that new space? And this was really a matter of transitional rule of law. They didn't frame it that way. The term transitional justice wasn't used yet, but it was really presented a problem of rule of law during transition. So let me just now, this was the context in which Dworkin ended up coming to Argentina and writing. Let me turn to the language that Ronnie used in his perception of the trials and how he saw the importance of these, as he called them, the trials of the torturers. So he saw the problem that the government was facing, and he saw the political pressures of both the military on the one hand and the human rights community on the other. And he saw that there was that it was very important to address the past, but he also saw the need, as he put it, I'm quoting, Argentina needed to bury its past as well as to condemn it. And there was a concern that many years of trials would undermine the sense of community, which is interesting to reflect back on 30 years later. So he went on to, to support the law that provided for jurisdiction to prosecute. There was would be an appeal to a civilian court. Ronnie supported the trial of the commanders, but then the question was what to do after that, how far down to go in terms of the trials of the military, and this is really where the issue, of the circumscribing or the scope of democratic justice arises. He wrote for the New York Review that the story he heard at the trials was very similar to the accounts in the Never Again, the Truth Commission that had been organized and was led by Ernesto Sabato, and he wrote about how the trial of the commanders was very clearly, he said it was legally much easier, morally less perplexing, and politically less dangerous than the further trials, and he had no doubts about the trials of the commanders. He said it was just a matter of organizing the proof that Nunca Más had already established. But then he went on to address the dilemmas of where to draw the line of transitional justice, and he acknowledged the weakness of the government at the time, and apparently even during the time that the Anglo-American philosophers visited Argentina, there were threats against Alfonsín and a concern about the stability of the government. There was even the threat of a possible state of emergency. So he says, and this I'm quoting from the New York Review, he says, in these circumstances, the government had good reasons to avoid divisive policies. Nevertheless, he said, we must hope the government will take that risk and prosecute anyone it can prove tortured or killed civilians, even under orders, even if it turns out that a small number may be convicted. The world needs a taboo against torture. It needs a settled conviction that torture is criminal in any circumstance, and that there's never a justification or excuse for it, and that everyone who takes part in it is a criminal against humanity. So, a very strong argument that he makes, and clearly not a retributivist. That's not where Dworkin's coming from. It wasn't a deontological argument. And he goes on to separate himself from the argument of the mothers. He says they're right to call for the prosecution of all the torturers and murderers, but not because they're entitled to vengeance, but, and here I'm quoting, because the best guarantee against tyranny, especially in countries like Argentina, where tyranny has often seemed acceptable to the majority, is a heightened public sense of why it is repulsive. Trials explore and enforce the idea that torture can have no defense. And he goes on. So what to make of that argument was really what drew me to this paper and this moment. On the one hand, he doesn't join those who support peace and settlement, immediate settlement with the military. He doesn't support the political pragmatists. On the other, he gives this argument that's humanitarian in nature. He talks about the suffering that he saw in the trials, and he thinks of trials, and not surprisingly, adjudication, a case-by-case approach, which is always Dworkin's very rich approach to law. He sees that as the strongest way to teach. And this is really an argument that's at heart expressive and pedagogic for criminal justice. And it really, to my mind, seemed to fit some of the discussion yesterday, Jacob's piece about the really the brilliance of Dworkin in moving beyond what seemed like opposites or dichotomous arguments state interests and peace on the one hand versus justice on the other. But he's, manifestly writing from a broader value that, you could say is a quest for integrity, a value of political morality. And he sees really the problem here as one of moving beyond the current situation in Argentina at that time, and really the possibility of the trials filling this role. And I would say there's a really significant overlap here with where Nino ended up, moving away from the Kantian view. He expresses more of a forward-looking preventative justification and radical evil on trial. Carlo Nino articulates an educative purpose for trials. He calls them the antidote to the elitism of closed authoritarian societies. Maybe it's very optimistic, but he calls it epistemic moral elitism, and that the educative effect of trials could be democratic because it would be seen in different ways by different elements of society. I know that I was a child at the time, and my grandmother, when we were afraid to go in the street, she would say, well, don't, they must have done something, and that, that was a general view by many. So his understanding was that the trials would be very significant even among non-perpetrators and victims, but really in the society at large. So let me turn to getting close to my conclusion. And that is what Ronnie's approach here, this idea that of a democratic-related justification for the trials, the combination, let's say, of the Nino Dworkin position that trials of torturers would promote public deliberation and understanding. Clearly, this is being revisited today in Argentina, and I think there are issues as well in the U.S. on this matter. So let's, think about the way we might revisit this, or a foreshadowing that this historical instance reflects. With respect to Argentina, we can see that today's trials are conducted not in the shadow of the vulnerability of a immediately, organized political transition, but in the context of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and really human rights language, rights to investigation, rights that are claimed to accountability. And we might ask, what would a Dworkinian approach yield in reflecting on some of these more absolutist positions on punishment? And you can find in various places in his writing, Law's Empire for one, an appreciation of integrity as an approach to punishment and justice issues in lieu of consistency when there are arguments of democratic political morality. So that's an interesting, I think, reflection that looking at Dworkin's approach would yield. I think also in terms of the U.S., the global war on terror, it's interesting to see how Ronnie's appreciation of the violations here may well have established a kind of sensitivity. He would be among the first to react to the torture, the claims of coercive interrogation by the U.S. in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. He wrote very clearly in the pages of the New York Review about these interrogations. He called them profound outrages of human rights, and he said that this was all already committed to. These, the idea that these were violations of basic democratic values. This was already in the Constitution, and the world is shocked by our willingness to abandon fundamental values just because our victims are foreigners. We must take care not to repeat. So he was already worried about the educational aspect, and he was already thinking about the educational aspect with respect to the United States. So in conclusion, it's the last point is really the role of philosophers and public intellectuals in these critical moments. And what's interesting to see is that the role of the Anglo-American philosophers that went down there was not that of, let's say, elite or technocratic experts. And Nino, was firmly opposed to that and really took umbrage. He debated some of the Americans that came, and instead one might say that the presence of the outside philosophers really provided more resources to this endeavor of moving from one political morality to another, and it amplified it, certainly in the writing that Dworkin engaged in, and it brought a greater clarity here, and you know, it's a sorely missed voice, I would say, these days in the U.S. and elsewhere. So let me end with that, and hopefully we'll have a chance for some exchange.
Thank you. We have 15 minutes for questions, and I'm going to begin with a short question. You are a student of transitional justice process, and I wonder whether whether in your large study of other experience, there is evidence that trials are good educative tools to build a taboo around torture, or truth commissions or other instruments are better when you think about the educative side of the project.
Can we collect it?
Yeah, we can collect. I don't have hands yet. Oh, Gustavo.
My question is about your last point, because it's clear for me that you emphasize that it's important, or it would be important, to give a place to philosophers to discuss about public policy and decide about punishment. And I have the impression that here we don't appreciate that, and criminal lawyers criticize decisions that Nino and Malamud take at that time. So what do you think about the role of philosophers in another kind of work related to public policy? Do you think that it could be a field for philosophers to work in public law, or I don't know, thinking about problems of health law, or I mean, which would be a role of philosophers in the relation with law in general?
Well, I don't think there's one answer about the trial's educative purpose. It's interesting to read about Germany. At the time of the Nuremberg trials, there were surveys of the German population around the trials and other elites, and they opposed the trials at the time. And now we know decades later there are other surveys, and Germany is one of the biggest supporters of the human rights agenda. You can say that they've replaced their more nationalistic ideology with a human rights identity, and it feels, you know, like a complete, you know, I don't know if moral education, but some kind of political education, and they're big supporters of human rights law. So I know that there is a moment of revisiting, but I think it should be a full revisiting, not just a line here and there, but really, if people are going to reflect about the trials, I think the fact that there are trials today, they may not be the same trials. They're not conducted for the same purpose. In my approach to transitional justice, the definition is not about the mechanisms. It's about the pursuit of justice and understanding. So that's what we would keep our eye on. And then if you have that definition of transitional justice, then you have enough pieces in the toolbox to be able to analyze or evaluate. I think the problem is that when people just associate it with mechanisms, then they're really at a loss for how to evaluate. And we have to keep in mind the concern for political transition, for a solid democracy, and maybe measured by that light, it may be too much to think that just a handful of trials of the commanders at that time could produce the kind of education that was needed in order to be able to reestablish or to create a new political morality here. Oh, that's not the answer to both questions. Public philosophers or public intellectuals? Well, that's a very big question. One thinks of, there are different cultures, political cultures, where intellectuals have a bigger role. One thinks of Roberto Unger in Brazil, or, we've had people like Larry Summers go back and forth from Harvard to various positions. Maybe in France, it's more common to have public intellectuals involved in policymaking. But my sense of what the philosophers were doing here was that it wasn't like the amicus brief. It wasn't saying, this is what you have to do. It was actually about opening up the conversation, not shutting it down. And I think that's a very important thing. You know, the commitment was to understanding and to appreciating that the country was at a juncture point where they had to move to a different political morality. And I think that Dworkin's approach, the pursuit of an interpretive approach that focused on those values, was a very important way to get beyond this kind of false dichotomies that were, you know, was how most of the society was, you know, that's how it was being represented at the time. So I think philosophers can be useful in getting past, if they're good philosophers.
Eduardo?
No, that's a very minor point about Nino, because it's a point of interpretation of Nino's work, or Nino's scholarship about his theory of punishment. I didn't note a shift. You imply that it has been a kind of shift or change from a Kantian approach to a rather forward-looking approach, but as far as I know, he always defended a forward-looking account, his consent theory of punishment. I don't know what you mean with this former Kantian approach. It's a minor point.
I guess, yeah, I mean, all I was saying, and I don't want to get in, you know, when one gets into theory of punishment, it kind of, we lose 2/3 of the group, but insofar as the legitimacy of his Kantian approach was consent by the perpetrator, what I'm arguing is that I think the engagement, again, it's an argument. I'm not saying that this is, you know, pages and pages of Nino's work, but I'm arguing that there's an overlap with Dworkin and that it became more about the democratic and expressive side of punishment. So it wasn't only relying on the consent aspect to legitimate it. Okay, we could have this, you know, I'm happy to have that conversation.
Ronaldo? Here.
Well, my point is, you put a lot of stress on one hand on the political intervention that Dworkin also made. He was here and was writing the New York Review of Books. He was also, in a way, I think, campaigning for these ideas for educational purposes. I was wondering, what in your opinion would be the limits for accepting the amnesty law according to his view? What would be the limits? You mentioned that, of course, the trials now wouldn't have the same sense, political sense and moral meaning that they had in the past. And according to your view, what would be acceptable in terms of amnesty for torturers?
Yeah, that's a big question, right? And I think the answer would be it depends. So certainly in terms of comparing integrity to consistency, he was not for formal consistency, and he writes in Law's Empire that he supports prosecutorial discretion. And it's an Anglo-American approach to criminal justice, that you know, that if there are reasons that the prosecutor has for which a trial of a certain, you know, accused would not, you know, and I think Dworkin would add the political morality project, that if it would not advance, you know, if that trial would not advance those goals, it's quite, you know, I think he understood the limits that the government made. On the other hand, as I said, he was for as many trials of convicted, you know, as many convictions of torturers as the government could get their hands on. So, you know, certainly I would say no blanket amnesty, right? This would not support a self-amnesty. You know, his argument doesn't support a blanket amnesty of any kind. A conditional amnesty of the kind that South Africa had, where you would get a lot of information, political disclosure. It relates only to the politics, to the crimes that relate to, let's say, apartheid or here, authoritarian disappearances. I think that's the answer would be it depends whether it would fit within whether it would advance the transition to a different political morality. So it means that the answer would depend on the circumstances. But I think there are some that are completely off the table. There are some amnesties that are completely off the table. But look, this is the situation that the Inter-American Court, the framework that we're now in, right, the rights framework. I know that Brazil is confronting this issue, and perhaps you have your own sense of the drama that's being played out in Brazil about this, right? What do you think? No, I mean, it's an exchange, so, I mean, it's just this...
I just, basically, I don't want to make a whole argument, but I think that this acceptance of a kind of use caution, some kind of simplistic kind of natural law that forbids any kind of amnesty, in my view, would be completely at odds with Dworkin's view, and I think this is what is being challenged.
So I'm saying there's a couple of lines in Law's Empire about prosecutorial discretion. This is clearly not his first emphasis, but from what we can tell, if the justification for the torturer's trials is this educative change, right, educative purpose and moving the country to a different political morality, then that's the broader question that one would have to ask. And then that gets back to your question of would truth commissions be better? I think the answer has to be it depends. What kind of truth commission, what, the nature of the systematic repression, what kinds of trials. I don't think, I have always opposed a one-size-fits-all solution, but I know that it's something that's being reflected on here about whether you're getting enough information through the trials today about to understand how things went so terribly wrong and how can they go differently in the future.
But if you let me say something else, but it's quite a challenge for all those rhetoric narrative of Trump's and avoiding this consequentialist kind of reasoning that is basically what is at stake whenever I think when it's reasonable and acceptable an amnesty. So it's quite a challenge for Dworkin thinking.
Thank you, Ruti, and have a very nice trip.
Thank you.
I give the mic to Roberto Saba.
To you. Oh, to me. Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to take a different. Let me use the better mic. I'm going to take a different view of both the trials and of Ronnie's writings on it, and of the debates with Nino and how settled they became. And I'm going to suggest that the rights as Trump's metaphor ran its course in the debates over the trials of the Argentine military. And in some ways, I want to come back to Argentina today at the end, and it's fitting because I first met Ronnie 30 years ago after I had been here in Argentina working with cells, working with some of the prosecutions of the military. I was asked to go meet with Ronnie and Tom Nagel and Owen Fiss and Tim Scanlon. Bernard Williams didn't come, to prepare them for their trip to Argentina and to discuss the kinds of issues that they were going to engage. Now, at the time, I was involved in a debate with Carlos Nino. I was a very young lawyer at the time. It seems impossible now, but and I was struck by the following scenario, because when you talk about prosecutions and trials, you have to understand the local setting. So I heard a story at a dinner that I was privileged to attend with Ernesto Sabato, and he told me a story about an experience in the hearings that led to Nunca Más that impressed him a great deal. And it was a young woman who testified. She was from Tucumán. Tucumán is a regional, provincial capital in the northern part of Argentina, relatively small town. Everybody knows everybody else. And the repression there didn't take place in the ESMA or in some obscure military base. It took place, like in most small towns, in the police station, in the center of town, and everybody knew what was what. And so this young woman testifies and says, I was raped. And I was raped, and that man raped me. And she identifies, she says, I've known him since grade school. He raped me. And under Argentine procedure, even if the government does not want to prosecute, she is entitled to file a complaint and demand a criminal action as an adjunct to her civilian complaint. So the actions of the government in stopping the prosecutions or not carrying forward the prosecutions do not follow the American model that is prosecutorial discretion from the top down. It means the government has to affirmatively act to shut down the prosecution of this woman. And I was struck by this, and then when I was working at Cells, and I encountered a file of somebody that Cells was representing, that I don't know if it was the same woman, but it was the exact same story from Tucumán, and I assume this happened more than once in Tucumán, so I can't say it's the same exact file. And what I was struck by was the moral and indignation that I felt, because rape is a distinct crime. There has to be physical arousal. You cannot respond to a command to complete the violent sexual act. And so the culpability jumped out, and I could not abide by the idea that the government, in the first instance of civilian rule, was going to reestablish the rule of law by shutting down the prosecution that this woman would ordinarily have been entitled to put forward, saying, this man raped me, and to have the legal consequences that followed. So I wrote a paper with Cindy Estlin, my wife, and Emilio Mignone, the great Argentine human rights figure, that said, if you're going to reestablish the rule of law, you cannot shut down the pre-existing accountability mechanisms that are there in Tucumán or in wherever, not just the prosecution of the military. Nino responded, and we had an exchange in one of the Yale Law Journals, and he said, the minimization of future social cost resulting from the destabilizing effect of widespread retribution is a factor that should be credited. Now, this was the terms of the debate. Nino, at the time, let's be clear, was playing a gambit which failed. And the gambit that the government had initially was to tell the military, you prosecute whomever you want, you deliver whomever you want to the civilian authorities, so long as it is somebody. And the military said, fine, we absolve everyone. Which meant not only did you have the generalized amnesty, the auto-amnesty that the military had proclaimed, but now you had something that looked like trials in the military tribunals of the leaders of the juntas, which means you'd had a kind of double jeopardy effect also if we imposed American language upon this. So this was the debate. And I don't hold my former position any longer. I think that it was unsustainable. Argentina could not have survived. You have to remember the time when every newspaper story in 1984 began with, today the government did this. And the next paragraph was, hoy el portavoz militar dijo lo siguiente. The military spokesman responded as follows. You had two governments, and it was not clear which one was going to prevail. And to declare war on the military authorities in 1984, I now believe would have been a losing proposition. I think that Nino was closer in that debate than I was. On the other hand, his particular gambit didn't work, and over time, other mechanisms worked much better than the trials, largely the elimination of the military budget, shutting down the military garrison in Palermo that would be the constant source of military activity in the city of Buenos Aires. So that was the debate, and that was a hard debate. So Ronnie comes down, and he writes this brilliant account of his experience in Argentina. There's not that much difference between the versions in the New York Review of Books and the version in Nunca Más. It's more or less just an elaboration of the same theme. And Ronnie reports this debate. And what I found striking was that he didn't resolve it. He didn't try to apply principle to it. He just reported it. And so he says as follows, and as his final account in the Forward to Nunca Más, he describes the importance of the trials and all this, but he says, it is desperately important, not only for Argentina, but for Latin America generally, that the Alfonsine government succeed. Absolutely. Great point. That's the most important principle. It is one of the few governments in the region firmly committed to constitutional democracy in our own sense, one of the very few we can respect unreservedly. But it is vulnerable to a variety of economic and political forces. This was the reality of the circumstance. But I was struck by one feature of Ronnie's description here. His claim as to why expedience might be justified was the reference to it is one of the few governments in the region firmly committed to constitutional democracy in our own sense. So then the question becomes, what are the elements of constitutional democracy? And this is where I want to start questioning the forward-looking prescriptive account that Dworkin could give. Because when you look at his account of constitutional democracy, if you, in fact, you look at his account of democracy, not just as a term, but what it operationally means, if you look at his account of democratic politics, it is almost empty. It is an extremely thin account. So he says, for example, if I have my notes correctly, he says, the democratic conditions are the conditions of moral membership in a political community. This is from Law's Freedom, which is, he has one essay in there which is his most, I think, sustained attempt to talk about democratic politics. So what are the conditions of moral membership in a political community? He identifies three. There has to be an organic nature to the polity. And by that, it's unspecified, but it's a very thin condition. I think it's simply that living here in Argentina, I consider myself an Argentine. Living in New York, I consider myself an American. It's a natural quality of the identification. The second is the guarantees of equal concern in the treatment of all individuals. That's a familiar Dworkin move. And the moral independence of each individual in defining herself as a self-respecting part of the polity. Okay, those are important conditions. Where do they lead? The very next paragraph is about the importance of judicial review and about the judiciary being able to impose a moral reading of the Constitution. Democratic politics runs out amazingly quickly. And when Ronnie returns to it, he says, when majoritarian institutions provide and respect the democratic conditions, then the verdicts of these institutions should be accepted by everyone for that reason. But when they do not, or when their provision of respective is defective, there can be no objection in the name of democracy to other procedures that protect and respect them better. There's not much elaboration of what the aim of a democratic transformation might be, and Ronnie finally concludes by saying that his vision of democracy as faithful to the moral commands of the Constitution as interpreted by a judiciary is superior to an account of democratic politics as being statistical. And by statistical, he means what is sometimes referred to as tabulatory. That is, that you take the pre-existing preferences of the members of the society, you add them up, and if more want one way than the other, that's democracy. Now, that account of democracy corresponds to no living society on earth. It doesn't correspond to anything but the most rudimentary accounts of how democratic institutions translate into the process of governance. And so if you think about Argentina 30 years ago, which was this incredibly vibrant place, I mean, hyperinflation, the military everywhere, the country devastated, but if you were in Buenos Aires 30 years ago, you would have been overwhelmed by the sense of hope in the population. You went to La Valle, and it was every movie that had been suppressed for 10 years was showing at the same time. You went to Corrientes, every play that had been a hit around the world was all of a sudden here. There was this cultural awakening, and there was the need for institutions to be created. And I think that's my main criticism of myself at the time, was thinking that you could just jumpstart back to the rule of law as it existed before without having an account of consolidation of democracy. And so what do I get then from Dworkin on Argentina? I get a tremendous sensibility. I get an understanding of the pragmatics of the situation, which is overwhelming. I get certainly the appreciation of the historic quality of the trials of the junta leaders. And by the way, some of it was silly drama. The trial of Firmenich. Come on, who really needed that at that point? You liked the trial of Firmenich also. Okay. Fine. Try Mario Firmenich, put him in the cell next to Videla. Okay. What? Lopez Rega, yeah, okay. All right, so you have an accounting, that's fine, but that's symbolic. That's not the building of democracy. So the question is, what to make of this today in Argentina? What's the prescriptive account? And my sense, looking back on 30 years, is that Argentina in 1983, 84, 85 was the harbinger of the third wave of democratization. It was the first country that self-consciously was moving from the period of institutionalization of autocracy, terror, whether it be in the Soviet bloc, whether it be apartheid, whether it be in the Latin American military regimes, into a post-authoritarian, post-autocratic era. And what was the account that we can most take from Dworkin? I think the account that we can most take from Dworkin is why rights were the historic conquest in the prior wave of democratization after World War II, and why primarily, as in the Nuremberg trials and elsewhere, we were trying to impose a vision of social responsibility and individual dignity upon rather well-functioning societies like Germany, like Japan, that had delivered their capacity for functioning to the acts of warfare and terror. When we're in this third wave of democratization, that we're talking about the former countries of the Soviet bloc, we're talking about Central Asia, we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about post-military Latin America, particularly Central America, you don't have those precepts of a well-functioning state. You don't have the institutions of mass participation. You don't have what you need for a democratic politics to take hold that can internally resist the capacity for a new terror or new abuses to come forward. And I think that there is actually very little in the rights as trumps, except as an more abstract moral command that tells us how to ground the institution. So let me just finish by saying, the striking thing about coming back to Argentina repeatedly over the past 30 years and seeing the development of the democracy is seeing what you don't see. And what you don't see is political parties. What you don't see is organized democratic politics. What you don't see is the stable intermediary institutions. What you see is increasingly clientelism. What you see is increasingly executive domination of social, economic, political life in this country. And that's the challenge. Does the rights trumps metaphor get us much traction on that? I have to confess I'm quite skeptical on that score.
Roberto Sam.
Well, first, when Sam was talking about Dworkin's idea of democracy, a memory came to my mind. 20 20 years ago, I was a student at Yale, and there was a conference for the memory of Carlos Nino, and Dworkin was there. And there was a dinner at Morris after that, and it happened that I was there sitting beside Dworkin. Pretty frightening to be sitting beside Dworkin. What to talk about? I mean, difficult for a 20 years old. And he asked me, I don't understand that idea that Nino had about deliberative democracy. I was frozen. I think I tried to explain, but I think I was very bad at that. But it connects a little bit with your description of that very slim idea of democracy. Well, my paper is changes the topic a little bit. Marcelo invited me and the people in this panel to work on some aspect of the legacy of Ronald Dworkin and Carlos Nino in Argentina, and in some way the paper connects with the last point that Sam made, that is about institutions and democratic institutions and the building of democratic institutions. And I think that Dworkin and Nino, part of their work was related to that, and particularly Nino was concerned about the work of a particular institution, which is the judiciary, and I will refer to that legacy. The first thing I think I need to establish is that, particularly for people who are not from Argentina, that the Argentinian legal system is very particular in some way, because since its very beginning, it has been created as a heir of a civil law tradition. It's the Argentinian legal system was built on that tradition, but at the same time, we are talking about the mid of the 19th century, we established a constitutional regime that looks very much like the American regime, particularly not only because the constitutional text is quite similar to the American constitutional text, but also because our Supreme Court decided a case at the very beginning of our legal history that resembles a lot to Marbury versus Madison, establishing judicial review. This mixture of a civil law legal system and judicial review creates, I think, some problems, particularly related to adjudication and integrity. The mixture that we find in Argentina was very particular at that time in the 19th century. But we can say that today this mixture has emerged either in some common law countries like in the US, and also in the European continental countries like any Spain, Austria, Italy, Germany, etc. In the US, we know that many authors have been puzzled by the fact that that common law system has been combined with the emergence of a lot of statutes that may look like legal system, resemble some sort of a civil law system. And after the Second World War, the continental European countries, after the creation of constitutional courts and some sort of constitutional review, have also combined some aspects of the continental law tradition with some aspects of this constitutional democracy system. The question has been framed by some authors. I mentioned there Glendon or Justice Scalia as a problem that either the U.S. judges have or the European judges have, that is a problem about the skills. They say that judges in the U.S. System, they were trained and educated for deciding cases according to the common law tradition, and now they are forced to apply statutes and regulations, and they don't know how to deal with these texts. In some way, they look with some envy to the skills that were developed by their peers in Europe, because they know how to do it. On the other hand, the European judges, some authors say that they are also lacking the skills to handle precedents and to work with precedents, because they were trained to apply texts, and then the appearance of these constitutional courts have been a problem for them to manage to work with cases, particular cases and precedents. I don't agree that the problem that arises because of these hybrid systems is a problem of skills. I think the problem is much more profound and complicated, and I think Dworkin and Nino understood the problem much better. I think the problem is related to the fact that, I will talk about the civil law tradition, assumes a certain theory of democracy, a certain type of democracy that is related to the idea that the people, or maybe better, the parliament, is sovereign. The parliament is the one that passes the law, and that political theory in some way impacts on the expectations that we have about what judges should do. According to that theory, we mistrust judges. We think that their job could threaten these people's sovereignty, and that therefore we should constrain judges as much as possible, and we can do that by forcing them to apply the text decided by the people without involving any interpretation, understanding by interpretation the decision, any decision related to values or morality, moral values. It's interesting, for instance, when Scalia says that America has become a continental law country because of what Calabresi calls the age of statutes. He demands this kind of constraint for judges. They should apply text without making decisions that I think him or Glendon says that they become too creative. They are very much afraid of the creativity, what they call the creativity of judges. The other, so I said, the root of the problem is, I think, is not about the skills. It's not that judges in one or other system lack skills, but is on one hand the problem of how we understand democracy, and the other problem is how we understand law. And I think that in the civil law tradition, or in the way that formalist judges or scholars understand how the U.S. system works today after the age of the statutes, understand law as the text. They overlook the kind of understanding of the law as a practice, the law as interpretation. My point is that here's where either Dworkin and Nino, I think, make a contribution to understand the practice of judging differently from the way we understand that practice in the civil law tradition. And here it comes the metaphor that Dworkin proposes and the chain novel game that he proposes, and we all know what is it about. But basically, I think that the important thing I think for me in that metaphor is that he understands that judges and other legal interpreters, but in particular judges, are part of a community devoted to make sense of the law. Some years ago, I went to a Dada exhibition here in Malva, in the museum that is a couple of blocks away from here. And I was walking through the halls, and I saw this work of these Dada artists that are called exquisite corpse. I don't know if that's a correct translation, but this is a game that they played, and it was about, as you may know, I mean, a game is about writing a sentence or a paragraph and then hide what you wrote and pass it along to the next player, and the next player writes another sentence or another paragraph, and then the game goes on. And at the end of the game, what you get as a result is a text with a lot of words that makes no sense. My wife thought that I was completely crazy because I saw that and I said, this is exactly the opposite to Dworkin's chain novel. And the idea, my question is whether we could understand the game that judges play in the civil law tradition as an exquisite corpse kind of game. I mean a game in which there is a community of people who are devoted to make no sense of the law, to destroy language. I mean, Dada's objective was to destroy language, to show that language can be destroyed, has no sense, no meaning, in a way to attack reason. I was thinking more about it, and I don't know if we could say that judges are playing the second game in a tradition in which they are not expected to pay attention to the other decisions, but I think they are playing that game without noticing it. I mean, I think the ambition of adjudication of judges' decision-making in the civil law tradition has this expectation of judges not destroying law, not destroying language, but the expectation is actually that integrity is achieved through the text. Integrity is achieved through the decision that is made by the legislator, and I think the naive expectation that they can perform their duty just, applying that text that is responding to integrity, and I think that's what the game they're playing. They're playing the game of, I think, like actors that are just reproducing the script written by someone else. I think misunderstanding what actors do. I mean, because they also interpret the text. I like to finish by saying that Dworkin's theory and Nino's theory. Nino reproduces the same kind of metaphor through the cathedral, the building of a cathedral, and this again, this collective, this community that is building across time a cathedral that has to resemble some sort of integrity, and I think that the contribution legacy that they made for our work in building institutions in Argentina is about trying to constrain our judges or to respond to the practice of judging, trying to put them some limits, as you know, related to keeping integrity. I think that is important because of two threats, and I'm not sure, but I think that probably Nino had that in mind when he developed this his theory that is very much in the line of Dworkin's. One threat is about formalism. As I described before, I think that he was concerned about the fact that, you know, this expectation of judges deciding according to the text without making any value decision was impossible. Probably he thought that this idea of what they do is actually hiding what they actually do, which is manipulating the text. On the other hand, I think they were thinking another enemy, another threat, which is skepticism, in the sense that judges can decide without making value judgments, but without any constraint. I would say that these days we are in the public discussion, I mean, having this kind of idea of judges being completely unconstrained, and therefore what we should do is to capture the judiciary in order to make decisions according to some moral theory or moral position. I will stop there. I want to say just that I think Dworkin's and Nino's legacy, it is crucial for these days, particularly because of what Sam said when he finished his talk, because I think we need to reconstruct institutions and particularly to reconstruct the practice of judging in Argentina. Thank you.
Martin Bomer.
Listening to Roberto, I remembered a joke, and the joke was old friends are sitting together at a table, and they tell each other numbers. They say 22, and the other one laughs like crazy, and the other says 31, and laughing again. And a newcomer comes in and says 25, and nobody laughs. And when he asks why they don't laugh, they say, because the way you told it was awful. I think we can do some sort of the same thing here, and I think I can take just a few seconds to say that what I want to say, and this is what I want to say. Heart, the nightmare and the noble dream, the totem, the young hostess. Dworkin, the chain novel, foxes and hedgehogs, the phalanx. Nino, cathedrals, roof tiles, and an orchestra. That's it. Thank you. But nobody laughs, so I need to, yeah, he knows what I'm going to say. So now to explain the jokes, this is what I want to say. In the early part of the last century, Borges posed the question that many were trying to answer. What is an Argentine writer? The question was an instance of a larger one, the question of the identity of the Argentine after the immigration deluge of the late 19th century. A century ruled by the Buenos Aires elite that had accomplished the incredible task of creating, almost ex nihilo, a national state and a functioning and fast-growing economy. It received the influx of immigrants that became, in a couple of decades, half of the country's population. Most of them would not even speak Spanish, and very few of them were received without reservations. The ruling generation witnessed that the promise of their parents came with a twist. They will rule over a bigger, more affluent society, but nobody had told them how to deal with heterogeneity, and even less so with anarchists, socialists, unionists. They were promised prosperity, not turmoil. Therefore, the question was, what is an Argentine? And from that general one, others like, what is the Argentine language? What is the Argentine literature? And then Borges' question, what is an Argentine writer? His first move is to deny a possibility that some had tried, that Argentine literature is literature of the Pampas. It is poems, short stories, essays, novels, and novels with cows and horses and gauchos. Borges did not agree. For him, those were foreign literature within an Argentine setting. So what is the background of the Argentine? Within which tradition can we write in order to be identified as Argentines? Let's listen to Borges' reply. What is the Argentine tradition? I believe we can answer easily, and that there is no problem in this question. I believe that our tradition is all of Western culture. And I also believe we have a right to this tradition greater than that which the inhabitants of one or another Western nation might have. All of the Western tradition. In effect, it had been here since the Spaniards, conquistadores, ever set foot in the Rio de la Plata, and now it is expanded with the arrival of the immigrants. Anything we write is ours. A French novel, an American mystery short story, a Persian poem, even Don Quixote. And since we are external to the tradition, away in the shore, not Europe anymore and not quite Latin America, we are condemned to freedom. Anything we write is ours. Or maybe more cautiously, everything Borges wrote was his. It was Borges' literature, and thus Argentine literature, though fatally it became universal. On the other hand, then, the French, the American, and the Persian were not quite as free as we were. To write a novel after Flaubert meant to write either à la Flaubert or against him. Flaubert became the background understanding of what it meant to write French literature, to be a French writer. The tradition binds us, provides a style, an understanding of a self. The second possibility is nothingness. The desert we call the Pampas, the absence of civilization, barbarism, silence. But there is a third possibility. The Argentines, according to Borges, having a right to the Western tradition, can produce any Western literature and write it in any way we wish because of a borderline situation. Because although we have every right that comes with ownership, we are alien to it, we are far away from its center in the shore. A few months ago, Discretion, a paper written by Hart on 1956, was found in Harvard's library. The paper reflected the difficult task Professor Hart was set to accomplish, to find a space between legal realism and legal formalism, or as he so beautifully put it later, between the nightmare and the noble dream. In this paper, he tried to clarify his idea of discretional legal decisions. For him, at that point, a discretional decision occupied the space between one made out of a whim and one dictated by rules. The discovery of discretion was important, the paper, was important for many reasons. It sheds light over Hart's famous visit to the US, his relationships with the members of the legal process school, and preeminently with Lon Fuller, etc. But mostly because it lends a new meaning to the concept of law, which was published a few years after Hart's trip. And since the concept of law was paramount to Dworkin's and Nino's theory, we can play with discretion's impact on the readings of the concept of law and see where it leads us. The concept of law has been read as the paramount positivist handbook. In Latin America, was also read as an improvement on Kelsen's pure theory of law. The comparison between the basic norm and the rule of recognition is a typical exam question in Latin America. Even if you can't believe it, it is. The concept of law is therefore read as providing a sound positivist description of the legal system, of any legal system, and the rule of recognition is understood as its main concept. The working metaphor here is that of the totem. It is found in Hart when he claims that the simplest form of remedy for the uncertainty of the regime of primary rules is the introduction of what we should call a rule of recognition. This will specify some feature or features possession of which, by a suggested rule, is taken as a conclusive affirmative indication that it is a rule of the group, to be supported by social pressure it exerts. The existence of such a rule of recognition may take any of a huge variety of forms, simple or complex. It may, as in the early law of many societies, be no more than that an authoritative list of text of the rules is to be found in a written document or carved in some public monument. Thus arises the totem, a public monument built in the village in order for the community to easily find the rules of the system. It is a single, univocal criterion that identifies the law. The metaphor, though, is misleading. It may be part of the reason why the concept of law was misinterpreted as if proposing a pedigree thesis, the position which holds that the law should be identified regardless of moral values and taking only into account whatever is found in the totem. It also very easily suggests a discretion thesis, in the sense that a conflict that is not solved by the rules found in the totem is left to the discretion, the mere will, of the person who has been assigned to decide through the rule of adjudication. And the same goes for an obligation thesis, the counterpart of the discretion thesis. If there is no legal rule, there is no legal obligation. This way of reading Hart, a reading that we owe to Dworkin, maybe, was very naturally borrowed in Latin America, and in a sense, it lent credibility to what Carlos Nino called ideological positivism, the idea that a judge should decide only using positive legal rules. That was one of the reasons why the arrival of Dworkin's theories to our shores, incredibly, was regarded by some as a natural law theory comeback, bringing with it all the dangers that authoritarian natural lawyers had created for freedom during the long periods of dictatorship. The totem metaphor had won the day. It was a pity, since the concept of law expressly rejects the easy reading of the rule of recognition as a set of propositions that someone can carve on a totem, and less so as a set of sentences that anyone can read from it. In fact, Hart goes on and asserts, no doubt, as a matter of history, this step from the pre-legal to the legal may be accomplished in distinguishable stages, of which the first is a mere reduction to writing of hitherto unwritten rules. This is not itself the crucial step, though it's a very important one. What is crucial is the acknowledgement of reference to the writing or inscription as authoritative, i.e., as the proper way of disposing of doubts as to the existence of the rule. Where there is such an acknowledgement, there is a very simple form of secondary rule, a rule for conclusive identification of the primary rules of obligations. What's that acknowledgement? What kind of skill of this position is it? Hart, in the very introduction to the concept of law, denies it is simply the identification of a meaning or inquiry into the meaning of a text carved on a totem. And he says, notwithstanding its concern with analysis, the book may also be regarded as an essay in descriptive sociology. For the suggestions that inquiries into the meanings of words merely throw light on words, it's false. Many important distinctions, which are not immediately obvious, between types of social situations or relationships, may best be brought to light by an examination of the standard of uses, of the relevant expressions, and of the way in which these depend on a social context, itself often left unstated. I find puzzling that Hart would stick to others' interpretation of his book, mainly to Dworkin's, as it is reflected in their famous debate. Why did he not pursue the examination of the standards, all these relevant expressions and the practice? Why not take advantage of Wittgenstein's insights on language as a practice? Why not follow up on the idea of standard uses? Why not on the ideas of social context, which is no other than the idea of background, that not only others such as Wittgenstein had worked on, but also he himself did in this very same book. Here is where discretion comes handy, to lend new meaning to the concept of law. In fact, it is an interesting example of resignification, a paper that was written previously to the book, but that we can only read long after we started discussing the book. The discussion, oh God, really? The discussion about discretion that this newly found paper promotes is remarkably different from the discussion that the discretion thesis actually promoted. And in discretion, Hart uses somewhat dated and gender-biased metaphor called, the young hostess. A young hostess is giving her first dinner party, and the question arises, shall she use for this occasion the best knives? They're all silver, very beautiful, but they're heavy and somewhat difficult to handle. And he goes on and on to show that this decision is neither a whim nor a necessary decision that follows rules. There are many ways of making a proper decision using the past, the wise advice from others, and so on. Enters Dworkin. When Brown v. Board of Education was decided, Dworkin was 25 years old. He had completed his first degree at Harvard, and later he would serve as a clerk to learned hand. In taking right seriously in the beginning, he exposes his scholarship, or what he wants to accomplish. The chapters of this book were written separately during a period of great political controversy about what the law is and who must obey it and when. During the same period that the political attitude called liberalism, once the posture of almost all politicians seemed to lose a great deal of its appeal. The middle-aged blamed liberalism for permissiveness, and the young blamed it for rigidity, economic injustice, and the war in Vietnam. What Dworkin is set up to do is to give liberalism a new economic, political justification and a new theory of law. And the attack is against positivism, Hartian positivism, and utilitarianism. What I tried to show is that what he saw was that with Brown and Roe versus Wade, with Brown versus Board of Education and Roe versus Wade, the agreements in the practice of the common law in the states began to break down. Legal theory, immersed in a discussion between late 19th century formalism and early 20th century realism, could not understand Brown nor Roe. And I think Learned Hand is an amazing example of that lack of understanding. So the central idea of Dworkin was to explain, to give a theory to Brown versus Board and Roe v. Wade and the new American law. So interestingly for Dworkin, the idea of how to defend the validity of a legal principle, in any event, though he wants to get away from Hart, follows the Hartian proposal when read through the lens of discretion. When Dworkin admits that we make a case for a principle and for its weight by appealing to an amalgam of practices and other principles in which the implications of the legislative and judicial history figure along with appeals to community practices and understanding. There's no litmus paper for testing the soundness of such a case. It is a matter of judgment. And reasonable men may disagree. The metaphor, Dworkin's metaphor to explain this is, as has been said, the chain novel. And the metaphor is the best novel, it can be construed as the work of a single author. And that will be a sort of a synthesis of his theory. Let me go on to, and I think what happened in the last years of Ronald Dworkin was that the court was moving away from that tradition, and that's why he came with this very nice metaphor against the court where he calls them a phalanx like a troops or police officers standing or moving in close formation to disrupt the American Constitution. He was really angry. The last thing I should say here, I have very little time, is that, that as Roberto has said, Nino's metaphor was in turn the idea of the cathedral. And Roberto has already explained it, so I'm going to make use of that. But I want to think whether the cathedral and the chain novel are the same metaphor, and I think they're not. The chain novel is a metaphor for conservatism, to keep the Brown versus Board best reading of the tradition of American law, whereas the cathedral, its two steps, is the effort of an Argentine scholar, as Sam has shown, that trying to see whether out of the ruins of a so-called legal system in Argentina, out of the ruins of the dictatorship, we can build a cathedral. And I don't know whether he thought it was possible or not. I think that the jury is still out. Borges says that we Argentines, or he as an Argentine writing in that time, was able to describe the Argentine literature and change the practice because we Argentines were like Jews to the Christian community, or like Irish to the English, or like Scottish to the English. We were close enough to know it very well, but far away enough to being able to criticize it. Three Jewish legal scholars creating lasting metaphors for us to better understand our practices and to improve them if we set our minds to the task. In doing so, they offered us a model for our legal professions, a model for the lawyer, the judge, and the scholar, with their theories, but also with their lives. They created works of art that still work, shining examples that still illuminate our practices, and thus gathering is evidence enough of their power. This gathering is evidence enough of their power. We here. Borges felt he was free to write whatever he wanted and created the Argentine writer. The following generations had to deal with him and the tradition he created. They were free no more. Hart, Dworkin, and Nino created traditions for all of us. We owe them the metaphors that make sense of our practices, and that, if we have the courage to follow their path generously and critically, also make us, their students, as better as we dare to become. Thank you.
Thank you. Before opening the floor, I'm going to ask some questions. Sam, I have a question for you. I share with you the concern about the limits of the centrality that rights had in the early years of the transition. But I want to suggest a way in which rights could have helped to build elements for a democratic polity if you look at 30 years afterwards. And there are two ways in which rights have played a very important role if you think in our democratic culture today. One, in being something that helped to organize social movements that have an important context in rights claims, and that's probably illustrated by the fact that we have laws such as the one that you cite today, protecting gender issues that we didn't. And I'm not saying that this is not a problem, but I'm saying that the rights framework might have been very important in laying the grounds for a different democratic community that we have today, and that is partly organized around the rights framing, putting a lot of pressure into the community, as it used to do 30 years ago. And the other way, it's in the use of rights through the activation of this horizontal accountability mechanism that today, even if lacking a lot to be perfectly working, are working better than 30 years ago. I'm just looking at the way in which courts are performing a different role than they used to. And in a way, these two transformations showed a different democratic quality that is channeling violence in a different way. And it might have been rights that played an important role that can change or have changed some traits of our undemocratic culture. And if you look at also the connection that social movements have today with some factions of the Peronist party, it's clearly that even if there is not a party, there is a connection with the basis that it didn't exist 30 years ago. And this might be something that's similar to the context in which Dworkin wrote, the civil rights movement and the social movements of the 60s and the 70s. And so it might have played an interesting role here. And just to put that in context, we may be building parties from the bottom up. And I clearly think that this is a more democratically connected community than the one we had 30 years ago. Roberto, we have had this discussion before. I think that what, I loved your metaphor about the data works, but I think it's a better metaphor to describe what Nino conceptualized as ideological positivism, what Martin described before. And it's not exactly what formalism in the US has been considered, not even for the classic formalism of Langdell, neither for the neo-formalist version of Scalia and the textualists. I think that that formalism is much more sophisticated than what we had and what Nino was fighting against. And this is why I think also that the rights discourse was so important, because it was about giving reasons. Though still I think that it was lacking on the governance and the institutional framework that relates to rights. That's what I think it's missing. The fact that rights generate a set of institutional demands and duties that were never considered into our discussions, and that connects also to Sam's point. To Martin, I enjoyed listening to your paper, but you should practice more your jokes, because I couldn't get it.
Do you want us to respond? I think I'd like to fully adopt your point. I think that this account of, shall we say, Rights 2.0 is an important part of the transformation of society. I mean, I have a book coming out shortly called Fragile Democracies, in which I argue that you've had a collapse of the legislative branch in most democratic countries. And so the question is, how do you reconstitute an opposition to executive power that is the problem of our age? And part of it is the emergence of strong courts, and certainly in Argentina today, that's the battleground, right? That's the battleground the president has chosen, and it's the fight of at least this year, is over the court.
But the other part of this is, how do you create social organizations, social movements, intermediary organizations, which in the Tocquevillian sense are the gist of a democratic society. And I don't read rights as trumps as necessarily providing a blueprint for that. I read it more as a justification for the imposition of a certain reading of the Constitution from on high. And I tend to take a more political view of how courts and societies are transformed. But if this is the groundwork for the mobilization of deprived groups in a society, rights-claiming groups that have been excluded, if this is the reason that Argentina could have been the leader in same-sex marriage and things of that sort, all the better.
Thank you.
Roberto? Yes, I as we discussed some time ago, I agree. However, I think that both ideological positivism and this kind of underdeveloped, less sophisticated formalism share the expectation that value judgments can be removed from judicial decision making. I think that I agree with you, but I think we still have the problem, and you can see that in the U.S. discussion too, I think.
Thank you. Martín Farrell.
At the beginning of, it's from Martin Boller. At the beginning of page 5 of his paper, Martin says that the idea that the judge should decide only using positive legal rules is an idea attributed to Hart. That was one of the reasons, he said, why the arrival of Dworkin theories to our shores was regarded by some, and quite astonishingly, as a natural law theory comeback. The totem metaphor had won the day. It was a pity, since the concept of law expressly rejects the easy reading of the rule of recognition as a set of propositions that someone can carve on a totem. Well, I am quite astonished that someone could find quite astonishingly that Dworkin could be considered a natural law theorist, because from the beginning, Dworkin was a natural law theorist. And if you take nowadays any companion of legal philosophy under the head of natural law theory, you'll find a name, Ronald Dworkin. What the totem metaphor shows is, for me, quite another thing. It doesn't show anything about Dworkin, but about Hart. It shows that Hart was a soft positivist and not a hard one, while Dworkin still must be considered a natural law theorist.
Okay, I'm sorry, I think it's the way I put it. The astonishing thing is that the comeback was regarded as an authoritarian stance and positivism. And many at that time, even ideological positivism, was thought as a stand for democracy. So at that point, I think I remember when we read for the first time No Right Answer, people like Carrillo and some friends of yours regarded the natural law comeback with great fear, because they thought that the only natural law theory that would exist and would exist ever was the kind of natural law theory that we had here that supported authoritarian regimes. So, and it was just a point for the Americans to I think, it was just a curiosity of the way theories arrived to our shores and got mixed with different discussions. The other part, I think, the part of the soft positivism is, I think, what happens with Hart is that he writes very long sentences, and lawyers tend to read just the first part of the sentence because they read too many dossiers, so they're not very conscientious reading the whole sentence. And when you read Hart's whole sentences, you see that he was not a positivist, not a soft, not a hard, nothing positivist, almost at all. He was a pragmatist. He was, as I tried to show with all the quotes that I made, he was aiming at a practice, and he said lots of times that law was a social practice. In the beginning of the concept of law, he said it was a social practice. He refused the Austinian reading of his book hundreds of times. And now that we read Discretion, the interesting thing is that that was obvious from the get-go. He was always a pragmatist. The problem is that Wittgenstein worked in Cambridge, and he was friends with Russell and Austin. But that's the same problem you had here, wanted to do morality with skeptics. But that's it's just an accident. So he wasn't a positivist, and less so. Dworkin was not very different from Hart. when you read Dworkin, the way you can read it, and I try to quote him here in those paragraphs, he was also a pragmatist. The only difference that Dworkin was an unrepented lawyer, and Hart was a repented lawyer. And Hart was too modest, and Dworkin was not. But I think at the end, the two metaphors they overlap, and they show a very interesting description. One of the common law system in England, of this gentleman Inns of Court kind of culture, and the other, the very difficult moment that the American law was living in the 70s, trying to put together this activist Warren Court within the straitjacket of ancient English common law.
I'm not going to quarrel with you about your description of Hart, but Dworkin describes Hart as a positivist. And then Dworkin quarrels with Hart because Dworkin was a natural law theorist. That's my position.
If you read him well, there must have been some sort of father-son kind of relationship or something that he needed to break away from Hart. But I don't think they are that different at the end.
Okay, we are in Buenos Aires. We needed a little bit of psychoanalysis at the end at this point. So I have 5 people, Marcelo, Paula, Eduardo, and Luis too. So we're gonna take.
Sam, I have 2 sets of comments. One regards the process of transitional justice in Argentina. First, a detail. The statute that was enacted declared the inexistence of the amnesty law of the military, established an appeal to a civil court regarding the decision of the military. So there was no double jeopardy problem there. Second, there were not 2 positions regarding what to do with the military. One position, as you said, was to try some of the military. The other was to try all of them. But there was another position, was not to try anyone, and that was the official position of the dominant party for the last 70 years in Argentina, the party that was supposed to win the elections in '83, the party that had the majority in the Senate. This, I think, it's a significant detail. Okay, then. About Dworkin and democracy. I think we shouldn't ask too much from a philosopher. He was a philosopher. His job was to deal with abstract ideas, and asking him for an institutional recipe for new democracies is like complaining because he didn't give us a recipe or a vaccine against Ebola. I mean, it's not part of what he was intending to do. But there is a very important, I think, contribution of Dworkin to the theory of democracy. I think he is one of the pillars of the current of deliberative democracy. The idea that democracy is more than majority rule, the idea that we should treat each other as partners in a community enterprise, and so on. And I think this is not a minor contribution, even to understand the problems of Argentina, because, as you well say, we don't have a problem of rules and institutions. You give the example of the primary system. You give the example of the public funding of candidate advertisement on television and so on. Those are good rules. And why do they fail? They fail because we don't have the right attitude. So Dworkin is relevant. Without something like the feeling of fraternal community, of being partners in the same project, all the institutions will fail. So I think there is some relevance in Dworkin's idea, even in the regarding the project of improving our democratic system.
Paula?
My question is a very small one to Martin. I agree with you that the idea of heart's discretion does not exclude the idea of proper, constrained, judicial decisions. But what I really don't see is why you need to read discretion, this last article, Harvard article, to realize or to arrive to that conclusion, because that's...
Eduardo?
Well, my comment is to Martin. And it's not about Dworkin or about Nino or about Hart, but about Borges, which is always fun to use in writing. And this particular essay is a very, very nice essay. I cannot avoid to quote one of my favorite sentences in this essay that he wrote in the 30s. He said something like, nationalism is a recent European trend that Argentine nationalists should reject as a foreign thing. And, okay, but he also says, and you quote Borges saying that the fact of being in the borders of a tradition is a privilege, or is something that make us in a better position to criticize, but at the same time to use those traditions. But I wonder whether this is a real deep thought, or is rather a nice thought. If we think seriously about that, the fact that the three Jewish philosophers were Jewish, I'm not sure that that's very, very relevant in this context, or that Borges' argument is doing some work in explaining why these three leading philosophers made their contributions. And even least, perhaps in the 19th century or in the 30s where Borges wrote that, but nowadays in the globalized world, I'm not sure that it's more than a very nice thought.
Luis.
So I think there's a certain ironic symmetry to this conference, since both the first and the last paper labeled Ronnie with positions that he would loathe. So I know why he loathes mine. I'm going to ask you something about pragmatism, because I don't understand. I don't think either he or Hart could be well described as a pragmatist. And I don't. Okay.
Thank you.
So, yes, I don't live in Argentina, and so when I think of the community of intelligent debate, I had two positions in mind: try just the leadership, or let the normal workings of the criminal justice. I did not consider, as part of the intelligent debate, amnesty them all, because whatever. So I will, on the final version, clean that up. Yes, thank you. So this is actually a very complicated question, because it's true that we would have been fortunate had Ronnie cured Ebola for us. It would have been a further contribution. But I don't think that the failure to have an account of democracy was as so removed from the corpus of his work as virology. And I think that the contribution to deliberative democracy was thin because the question that a profound engagement with deliberative democracy has to confront is whether it's the process that is the determinant of the legitimacy of the outcome or whether there are pre-existing constraints on the deliberation that must yield a certain preset range of positions. And the more interesting deliberativists, people like Josh Cohen, people who have engaged a very old tradition of democratic theory, move back and forth across that level of debate. I don't think that debate was very important for Ronnie. I think that and I am not the Dworkin scholar that you are, I will confess that. I had the office next door to him for 10 years, but very little penetrated the walls. I think that in either direction, it was very, very good construction, Louis. I think that the problem is that democracy as such interested him less than the correct ideas that he focused on in his youth and then the role of the judiciary that developed thereafter. And I just, it's not simply that it was only a deliberative theory of democracy. It was an inattentiveness to the institutional detail. I mean, what I found remarkable about Carlos Nino from the time I met him was that everything for him had to be translated into real power, real institutions, real politics. It had an immediacy of the payoff. The setting where Ronnie felt the greatest realization of his theories was in the judiciary. It wasn't in the world of lived politics among the population. Excuse me? Colloquium. And yes, in the colloquium, yes. Yes, but if you attended the colloquium, most of the deliberation came from the people up front, and so.
About why we need discretion, we don't. It's just I think explains. Maybe I was too. Maybe it helped me explain better what I thought it was in the concept of law, and I haven't seen it. But I'm a lawyer. Pragmatism. I try not to use the word in the paper, but I used it in the heat of the debate with Martin, just to throw that thing into the discussion. But I think. There's all this revival of American pragmatism after Rory and other people, and I think that is a very fruitful thing to do. I think well, I know that he opposed it, but what can you make of the idea of social practice, the idea of wise men, being, agreeing on reading the Constitution under its best light, and I don't see how that can be related to a Cartesian propositional kind of legal theory. So I think even against him, for his own good, I think he should be. And I think Hart would also disagree with me, but maybe. But yeah, but I think it's for their own good. I'm doing this for their own good. About Borges, I think the three parts, you're either part of a tradition, and there's no way you can get away from it, like the French novelist, and the utmost nothingness of the silence of the pampas, where there's no culture at all. It is a nice metaphor for let's call it formalism and realism or whatever you may call it. The idea that the French don't have freedom, and on the other side there's nothing but whatever you want to do. So, and there's no actual decision to be made in any of those, in those settings. So what does it mean to make a decision? What does it mean to actually make a decision? Is it just, whim cannot be, it's not you making the decision, it's your whim. And if you are doing it following rules, it's somebody else who wrote the rules. So what does it mean to actually make a decision? And what he, I think, wants to say is that it's along those lines. I should maybe think more about it and write something more. He says, we have the right to the Western tradition. We have a right to this tradition, greater than what which the inhabitants of one another Western nation might have. So the idea is to have a right means that you have autonomy. What you make is yours. And in that sense, the idea of having a right to a culture, not being imposed by that culture of a decision. Or the other point is that whatever you do is your decision because you just do it. I think it is some sort of a metaphor of the problem that we lawyers have when we discuss about rule abiding and pure freedom. And we all know that it cannot be any of them both. There should be something in the middle, and we don't know what it is.
Thank you. It's been a great opportunity to honor Dworkin, the pragmatist and the liberativist. No, thank you, truly. It was a pleasure to share with you this homage to a great man who had a lot of influence in our culture and our life, and our legal culture especially. And I also want to thank the team of the Secretaría de Investigación for the organization, especially Natalia Ragusa and Nahuel Maisley, and I also want to thank the translators for their help. And Marcelo is going to say bye and give you the logistics for tonight.
Bravo. No?
Thank you all. I think it has been a wonderful conference. I hope we can publish the final versions of all the papers if you want. And we are meeting at 8:30 and at Palacio Duao, right? Thank you.
Marcelo, por Alvear o por Posadas. ¿Cuál de los dos restaurantes? ¿Vamos arriba o abajo? ¿El restaurante cuál es?